All right, Lecture 4, the American Revolution. So it is time to be revolting. Definitely going to split this one into a couple of different lectures because I'm not sure that I can talk all the way through it in one sitting. So let's get started on the first part of it. So when the Revolutionary period starts, it's really right at the end of the 7 Years' War. Like, we usually date it to 1775, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, but the trouble starts as soon as the last war ended. George III is the King of Great Britain. He became the king in the middle of the 7 Years' War, and yet nobody on either side of the Atlantic imagined that he would lose the colonies within the next 20-ish years. But the 7 Years' War left Britain with an enormous debt and with really more overseas territory than they could defend. And so that led the government in London to kind of desperately look around for a way to pay off the war debt and to support a standing army to defend all of this territory that they now have. And the route that they came up with was to try to make the colonies pay their fair share. I think we kind of have the impression that the taxes that Britain passed on the colonists were just incredibly high taxes. They weren't. The tax rate in Britain itself was getting quite high. But over here in the North American mainland colonies, it ended up being the equivalent of less than $1 a year, even with all of the taxes. And even if all of them had actually gone into effect, which not all of them did. So the question's not really how high the taxes were. The question became whether or not Parliament had a right to pass those taxes in the first place. And the colonists, who up until this point believed that they were among the freest people in the world, came to conclude that being in the British Empire was a threat to their freedom, and that will set them on the road to revolution. Now, the colonists had given money and resources and soldiers to fight the 7 Years' War, and they believed that it had proved that they, the colonies, were important to Britain's status as a great power. And Britain certainly agreed with that, and Britain wanted to guarantee that the colonies would continue to give that support. And to do that, they began to meddle like they'd never meddled in the colonies before. Before the 7 Years' War, the British government had occasionally stepped in, like sometimes the colonies tried to issue their own paper money, which was a no-no, and Parliament would stop that. They've got the mercantilist laws, and that restricted colonists' ability to compete with homeland British manufacturers. But the colonists mostly ignored those laws. And now, all of a sudden, the government is demanding that the colonists obey, which they've kind of gotten out of before. During the 7 Years' War, the British government had treated the colonies as allies, almost as equals. After the war, though, Britain wants to go back to seeing the colonies as subordinates, whose main role is to make the mother country rich and powerful. But the colonists have now, in the war, tasted that little smidgen of equality, and they're not willing to go back to the old way. During this time period, the government in London started to involve itself in the colonies in absolutely unprecedented ways. They wanted to make their control of the colonies more efficient so that they could raise money to pay off their debts. And nearly all British politicians in England supported the laws that were outraging the colonists. In general, British folks in Britain felt that the colonists ought to be grateful to the empire. And the colonists had kind of started this war by accident, and in order to fight the war that the colonists started, Britain had borrowed more than 150 million pounds sterling, which would be trillions of dollars in today's money. Half of the government's revenue every year went just to pay the interest on that war debt. And the tax burden in Britain itself was becoming really intolerable for a lot of people. So it just made sense to them. It just seemed reasonable to ask the colonies to pay at least part of their share, to pay for protection from the military, and to, for once, stop cheating the treasury with all this smuggling, because colonists loved smuggling. And nearly all Britons believed that Parliament had a right to pass laws that controlled the colonies. We're starting to see a divergence. We're starting to see a separation in the way that the colonists think of a good government and the traditional British image of a good government. Traditionally, there's this theory of government called virtual representation. Virtual representation said that every member of Parliament didn't just represent his own district, he represents the entire empire. So if every single member of the House of Commons was born and raised in London and had never traveled outside of London, under virtual representation, they were still seen as representing the entire empire, including Boston and Richmond and India. Well, here, the way that the U.S. has developed, we have representatives specifically for our state, and then even within our little area of our state, right? Northeast Oklahoma has a representative elected just by us, by our district. And he goes off to the national government and he passes laws that are supposed to be beneficial specifically for our district. And we trust him to do that because he's one of us, right? He's from our area. We wouldn't necessarily think that someone from Miami, Florida would support laws that are good for Miami, Oklahoma, right? But the traditional British view of government said, under virtual representation, that it doesn't matter where your representative is from, he's still your representative. Now, folks in the colonies were starting to say, they're starting to split with this. They're starting to argue that if all of the members of Parliament are only from England and a couple from Scotland, how do they know what any of the colonies need? The colonists are arguing that there needs to be somebody in Parliament from Virginia and from Carolina and from New York to make decisions that are good for these colonies with the understanding of someone who comes from those colonies. But when the colonists began to complain that they didn't have real representation in Parliament because no one sat there who was from the colonies, that didn't make sense to most Britons in the mother country, because they still hold to this virtual representation idea. Now, when Parliament would pass laws governing the colonies, they very quickly discovered that without colonial cooperation, those laws weren't worth the paper they were printed on. Over and over again, especially during this time period leading up to the Revolution, Parliament will pass a law, the colonists will either ignore it or they'll protest, and then Parliament will back down until they get another brilliant idea and try it again. The British government had already alarmed a lot of their colonists by issuing that proclamation of 1763. That had barred settlers from traveling west of the Appalachian Mountains. Well, the very next year, the Prime Minister of Britain introduced a new law. This is the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act, on the one hand, did something good, on the other did something that colonists didn't like. The good thing was the Sugar Act reduced the tax on molasses imported from the French by half. Now, that's okay. Colonists like sugar. They also like the rum that is distilled from sugarcane products. But that act, on the other hand, created new mechanisms that were meant to cut down on sugar smuggling by the colonists. Smuggling was a major source of colonial income, particularly for the colony of Rhode Island. If you've ever looked at a map, Rhode Island has almost no actual land to it. It's all these little bays and inlets and caves that are perfect for smugglers to hide out in. And before the Sugar Act, if a smuggler was caught, they were tried in a court in their own colony. And the jury tended to be sympathetic toward the smugglers because often the men who, were wealthy enough to serve on the jury were smugglers as well. So if you were a colonial smuggler and you got caught, you probably wouldn't even be convicted. Under the Sugar Act, though, smugglers will be taken out of the colonies and they will be tried before the admiralty courts, the military courts. They're not going to be jury trials. They're not going to be trials in front of their peers. It's going to be members of the military deciding their fate. So yes, the Sugar Act cut the tax on molasses and sugarcane products. But in colonies that had a lot of smugglers, it's not like they were paying the tax beforehand, right? They were skipping out by buying from the smugglers. So the colonists viewed the Sugar Act as a way to force them to pay a tax that they had pretty successfully evaded up to this point. At the same time that the Sugar Act was passed, Parliament passed a Revenue Act. That Revenue Act took a whole list of products that had to be sold only through British merchants and added new goods to them. So it's strengthening the mercantilist system. Before this, the colonists used to be able to buy some things directly from foreign sources, like they could buy wool directly from the Dutch. But now, under the Revenue Act, those things are included within the mercantilist system, and that's cutting into the colonists' money. And the Sugar Act and the Revenue Act together not only seem like the empire meddling in a way that they shouldn't, but those two acts also kind of aggravate what's becoming a serious economic recession, and so that hurts people's pocketbooks too. Now, the Sugar Act and the Revenue Act, they're both attempts to strengthen mercantilism. And mercantilism has been around for like a century and a half at this point. The colonists usually ignored mercantilist laws, but they're at least used to them, right? So the colonists understand the Sugar Act. They understand the Revenue Act. They don't like them. They try to get around them, but they understand those laws. But in 1765, this is the very next year, actually you can pretty much count on from 1763 until the end of the Revolution, Parliament is going to do at least one thing every year that will seriously hack off the colonists. So in 65, we get the Stamp Act. And for the first time, this is Parliament trying to raise money from direct taxes on the colonies. The Stamp Act does not regulate trade. It's not a mercantilist law. It's a direct tax. The Stamp Act required that all sorts of printed material, newspapers and books and court documents and even playing cards, had to have a stamp purchased from the authorities. And the purpose of the Stamp Act is to raise money to help pay for a standing army that Britain wants to permanently station in the colonies. Parliament might have been able to raise that money if they had asked the colonial assemblies to do it, but instead they chose to enforce a new kind of tax without colonial consent, and just all hell broke loose. The trading laws, the Sugar Act, the mercantilist laws, those usually affected kind of just port cities. But the Stamp Act managed to offend nearly every free colonist, whether they were rich or poor, or farmers or craftsmen or merchants. And the Stamp Act was especially hated by those folks who wrote and published and read books and newspapers, the guys who were trying to pay attention to politics. Hey, you want to exercise your civic virtue and be politically aware and engaged? Tax on your newspapers. Tax on your pamphlets. Some of them felt like Britain was like intentionally punishing them for trying to be involved in politics. And then what Britain intended to use the money for was also a problem. Britain wanted to use the money to pay for a standing army to defend their new frontier. But the men that they want in their standing army will not be British citizens from the colonies. They will be men from Britain itself. And the colonists see that as almost like a foreign army coming into their territory. I mean, and I know that that doesn't make sense because the colonists still very much consider themselves British, and they're proud to be British. But their point of view is, if anyone's going to stand on the mountains and defend this territory, it ought to be, maybe landless men from Pennsylvania or Rhode Island, or, maybe create jobs here in the colonies, instead of using this as a way to dump your poor landless men from London and Birmingham and Leicester, over here. So they're grumpy about that. And then by imposing the Stamp Act without consent of the colonial assemblies, Parliament was directly challenging the authority of those colonial elites, the ones who had, up until now, controlled the law and the money and the land for generations. So they're angry too. The opposition to the Stamp Act was the first real drama of the Revolutionary era. And it's the first time that we see a real split between the colonists and the empire over what it means to be a British citizen and what freedoms you can expect as a British citizen. Most of the crises that we've talked about so far have been between different groups of colonists, between colonists and native people. This is the colonies versus their empire. Nearly all colonial politicians oppose the Stamp Act. While they are voicing their grievances, they talk a lot about the rights of the free-born Englishman. Now, a handful of them are starting to talk about the natural rights of all mankind, but the vast majority are talking Magna Carta, rights of Englishmen, time-honored British principles and British liberties. They're still really proud to be British. They just want to be treated as equally British. There are clashing ideas of the empire itself and what it meant to be a part of that empire. Colonial leaders thought that the empire should be this association of equals, where free settlers overseas would have exactly the same rights and privileges and powers as Britons at home did. And colonists in other parts of the empire, like in India, felt the same way. But the imperial government and its representatives in the colonies saw the empire very much as a system of unequal parts. They felt that each different region should have different rights and different laws, and that all of them should be subject to Parliament. And the imperial government didn't see a problem with this. They didn't see it as a loss of freedom. They believed that their Parliament was, they called it the sanctuary of liberty. And they didn't realize that many of their colonists were starting to disagree. Now, some opponents of the Stamp Act tried to distinguish between bad taxes, these direct taxes like the Stamp Act, which they said Parliament had no right to impose, and those trade regulations, which they were used to and which they said were more okay. But some Americans, some colonists, because they're not calling themselves Americans yet, some colonists are starting to say that maybe Britain had no right to tax them at all. Definitely not with the stamps, but maybe also not with the tariffs, because there were no colonists in the House of Commons in Parliament. The Virginia House of Burgesses adopted 4 resolutions stating that colonists ought to have the same rights as citizens in the mother country, and that the right to consent to taxes was the cornerstone of liberty. By October of '65, 9 colonies had sent representatives to the Stamp Act Congress. They met up in New York City, and they laid out some resolutions about how they're going to deal with this stamp tax problem. First, they said that the colonies are loyal to Britain, loyal to the king, loyal to Parliament. But then they went on to say that the right to have their representatives consent to taxes was essential. And they got merchants throughout the colonies to agree that they would boycott British manufactured goods until Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act Congress and this boycott was the first time that the colonies had really cooperated with each other. I mean, up to this point, they've mostly ignored each other or they've squaffled over territory. In a sense, the Stamp Act kind of created the first united America. And the word that these Stamp Act critics most loved to throw out there was liberty. They are for liberty. The empire is killing liberty. Some of them actually staged mock funerals for liberty. Like they would carry a pine coffin and somebody's wife would embroider a shroud with the word liberty and they would drape it over and they would very theatrically weep over the coffin of liberty. As the crisis continued, the symbols of liberty were everywhere in the colonies. Like in Boston, they designated a tree in the Boston Commons as the Liberty Tree, and they hanged an effigy of their stamp distributor from the Liberty Tree. And then drawings of the Liberty Tree started showing up in prints and pamphlets all over the colonies. In New York City, they put up a pine mast to mark the spot where all of their protests would start, and they called it the Liberty Pole. Colonial leaders decided that they were going to stop the Stamp Act from being actually implemented. And they were actually pretty successful at that. Even before the act was officially passed, towns across Massachusetts were creating what they called committees of correspondence to work with each other and coordinate how they would oppose the Stamp Act, and then also the Sugar Act and the Revenue Act and other laws that they didn't like. And then those committees started to spread throughout all of the colonies, and they would write letters about what they're going to do to stop these laws from being put in place. So like Boston would write down to Savannah, we're going to hang an effigy of our stamp distributor. And Savannah's like, well, we're going to tar and feather our stamp distributor. Which, yeah, this is a picture of that, and it's actually a pretty traumatic thing to have happen. I don't know if any of you have messed with tar. My grandparents had a tin roof, and so every summer we would get up and patch it with tar. And to get it spreadable, it has to be just under the boiling point. So the tar is really dangerously hot when you put it on somebody. And then if you dump a feather pillow over them, how do you get those feathers off? Second and third degree burns and massive traumatic scarring was not unusual at all. Fortunately, tarring and feathering was pretty rare. It hardly ever happened in real life, but it did happen a few times, and it was a very potent threat if somebody was doing something you didn't like. The movement against the Stamp Act was started usually by members of the elite. But it started to gain momentum among regular folks. John Adams was a Boston lawyer who was starting to make a name for himself. And he said that the Stamp Act had inspired people even in the lowest ranks to become more attentive to their liberties. But these opponents aren't just debaters. Crowds destroyed shipments of stamps, and they intimidated the stamp distributors. In New York City, hundreds of people paraded through the streets nearly every night in December of '65. And a lot of these activities were organized by a group who called themselves the Sons of Liberty. Now, the Sons of Liberty were usually self-made men. Often they had made their money as privateers. During the 7 Years' War, they had attacked French ships and stolen all of the stuff off the French ships and then sold that stuff elsewhere. So the Sons of Liberty, many of them got their start as really pirates. They're not members of the upper class. They're not the elite. But they have a good following among the sailors and the dock workers and often the craftsmen in their cities. The Sons of Liberty took the lead in enforcing the boycott. But sometimes parades and boycotts turn to violence. In November, a crowd destroyed the home of a British Army major who was sent to enforce the act. And the British government was kind of stunned by that. So they decided to kind of retreat a little bit. Because of the violent opposition that they're seeing, and also because some British merchants are afraid that if the boycott continues, it will hurt them. So in 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. The colonies celebrated, but Parliament did something when they repealed the Stamp Act that's going to have a future effect. The colonists don't pay a lot of attention to it at first. When Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, at the same time, they passed a new law. It was called the Declaratory Act. And that it essentially said that Parliament has the authority to pass any laws it wants for all of the colonies, and the colonists must obey without protest. And the colonists are just so happy that the Stamp Act has been repealed, the immediate cause of tension is gone, that they don't really pay attention to this Declaratory Act that's going to cause them problems in the future. Then the very next year, 67, the government in London again decided to impose a tax on Americans. And these taxes were developed by the chief financial minister, a man named Charles Townshend. So they are collectively known as the Townshend Acts, and over here became the Townshend Crisis. When the colonists had been busy fighting the Stamp Act, it seemed like a lot of them were saying, direct taxes bad, trade regulation okay. So Britain decided to raise the money that they're still trying to raise by trade regulation. Townshend got Parliament to pass a whole slew of new taxes on imported goods and to establish a new board of commissioners to collect the taxes and get a handle on all that smuggling. And Townshend intended to use the money to pay off the war debt, pay for a standing army, and pay the salaries of the colonial governors. And that's a problem. I mean, what's so bad about having Parliament pay the governors? I mean, the governors have to get paid anyway, right? But before the Townshend Acts, most colonial governors were paid by the elected colonial assemblies. We talked about that in the last lecture, right? Like they vote every 6 months or every year. Do we pay the governor? Has he done what we wanted? Okay, then we'll pay him. And that was a really good carrot and stick to use to make the governors do what the assemblies wanted. If you're a good governor in their minds, if you do what they want, then you get the carrot, you get paid. But if you don't do what the assemblies want, you get the stick, you don't get paid. Townshend and a lot of other British officials didn't like the idea that royally appointed governors were being jerked around by the colonial assemblies. So they saw this as their chance to put a stop to it. And the assemblies, of course, immediately threw a big frickin' tantrum. And leaders in several colonies decided we're going to start the boycott up again. The boycott started in Boston, which you can kind of take it as read from here on out that almost everything is going to start in Boston. They kind of become troublemakers. But then the boycott spreads. The southern colonies get involved, and it became a patriotic act not to buy British. It became a symbol of your resistance to tyranny if you wore homespun clothing instead of imported silk, if you bought American-made products, or if you could, make your own. It became this kind of symbol of self-sacrifice instead of the luxury and the indulgence that was associated with the British Empire. Women who wove their own cloth at home so their families wouldn't have to buy British were called the Daughters of Liberty. And the idea of using homemade rather than imported goods especially appealed to those Chesapeake planters. Like we talked about in the last lecture, they were spending a lot of money trying to live like the British nobility, and many of them were increasingly in debt to British merchants. This boycott gave them an excuse to stop spending money and not lose face. It's not that they're cheap, and it's not that they're broke. They're being patriots by not buying new things and also by not paying off their debts. Now, American craftsmen, colonial craftsmen, also liked this boycott because up until this point they've had to compete against British-made goods, and they were always at a disadvantage. But now the boycott says people shouldn't buy British-made goods. Gosh, I guess that means I'm going to have to buy from Joe down the street instead. Now at first, colonial merchants were a little bit reluctant because the boycott threatened their livelihood. If folks make their own clothes and their own goods, then the shops lose out. The merchants were also kind of afraid of stirring up the lower classes with all of this talk of liberty. You start saying it's okay to rebel against authority, well then where does it stop? If it's okay for me to rebel, then is it okay for somebody else to rebel against me? I'm not sure I want to take it that far. And just like with the Stamp Act crisis, mobs started filling the streets of the major cities to hold protests and burn effigies, and also to enforce the boycott by raiding shops and punishing merchants who didn't want to take part. And Boston once again became the focal point of conflict. What will become the Boston Massacre has a really long, complicated backstory, but the short version of it is, in 1768, the British Empire had seized a ship that belonged to a very prominent man in Boston, John Hancock. They had seized Hancock's ship for violating the trade laws, which he was a smuggler, so violating the trade laws was basically his job. But he was very prominent. A lot of sailors and dock workers, their livelihoods depended on him. So they rioted when the British seized his ship. And so the British sent troops into Boston, and they were stationed there for a couple of years. They'd been there since 1778. And it was bad enough to have these kind of semi-foreign troops in their city, but also the soldiers that were stationed in Boston weren't paid very well, and so they would go out looking for other work. And so the citizens in Boston, the men in Boston, felt like, we've got this foreign occupying army, and now they're taking our jobs. And there had been a number of increasingly violent confrontations between off-duty soldiers and especially the dock workers in Boston, because that's often where the soldiers went to try and find extra work. And in March of 1770, five, is that right? Is it 5 or 7? Very small number. I think it was 7 British soldiers who were off duty had gone down to the docks to look for work, and as they made their way back to their barracks, they were surrounded by a growing crowd of angry Bostonians. And by crowd, I mean literally hundreds of people. So these 7 guys, not even in uniform, are surrounded by hundreds of people who are shouting at them and threatening them. And then they start throwing snowballs, but then they start throwing snowballs with rocks in them. And then they stop throwing snowballs and they just start throwing rocks. And so these soldiers end up running all the way back to the barracks with hundreds of angry men on their trail. And 2 other people are in the barracks, their officer and another off-duty soldier. And those 2 step outside. And so you've got now these 9 British troops facing down hundreds of angry people who are shouting and throwing things at them still. And somewhere in the chaos, somebody shouted, "Fire, damn you." Now, obviously, on the Bostonian side, they said that the British officer had said, "Fire, damn you," that he was giving an order to his troops to fire. But that's not actually a military order. So, of course, the soldiers said it was somebody on the other side who were, goading them into shooting. But whoever said it, whatever happened, it was a hugely chaotic environment. A couple of the soldiers did open fire, and 5 Bostonians died. The soldiers were put on trial. The soldiers and their commander were put on trial in Boston for murder. They were defended by John Adams. Now, Adams really did not like having the troops in his city, and he really sympathized with the workers who felt like they had to compete unfairly for jobs. But he also believed that acting outside the law, attacking these soldiers, and trying to provoke a violent response, that's not the right tactic. So he got 7 of these soldiers to be found not guilty, and the commander and one other man that they could prove had actually fired a shot were convicted of manslaughter. Now, that story doesn't sound very much like a massacre, right? Paul Revere was a member of the Boston Sons of Liberty. He was a silversmith, and he wanted to use this story to get people in other colonies stirred up. You know, if you tell the story down in Jamestown, Virginia, a group of Bostonians surrounded some soldiers and threw stuff at them, and the soldiers fought back, that's not going to get Boston any kind of sympathy at all, right? So he made this engraving that has become the most enduring sort of image of the Boston Massacre. But it's a really misleading image, right? I mean, it shows the massacre, I'm using air quotes here, happening in broad daylight. And it shows British troops in uniform, all lined up in good order, with their commander clearly giving them an order to fire into a crowd of poor, innocent, unarmed civilians. When in reality it took place in the dead of night, and there were hundreds of people throwing things at these 9 guys. The real story doesn't get Boston sympathy. Paul Revere's fake story, though, does. By this point, the whole Townsend crisis boycott is starting to collapse. Colonial merchants are losing money. The elite are getting bored, wearing homespun cloth. British merchants pushed Parliament to repeal the Townsend Acts because they were losing money too. So when Parliament agreed that they would pull their troops out of Boston and lift the tax on everything except tea, American merchants happily abandoned the boycott. So once again, the immediate crisis is over. But many colonists were starting to believe that Britain was becoming as corrupt and as afflicted as other empires, as bad empires, and starting to believe that they were in danger of losing their liberty. And that belief and that fear is still going to be boiling under the surface when the next crisis comes up. And the next crisis comes up right on schedule. In, this one is 73. So we just get over the Boston Massacre, the Tea Act, not the Tea Act, the Townsend Acts have just been repealed, and now Parliament does something new. So in 73, Parliament adopts the Tea Act. The Tea Act was kind of an early corporate bailout. The British East India Company had been sent to India after the 7 Years' War. They were supposed to help consolidate Britain's power over India, and they were supposed to organize the labor of the people of India to benefit Britain. But they're not turning a profit. And without money, the ability of this company to organize the labor and help the empire gain control is very limited. So in order to boost the profits of this company, the British government offered them a set of rebates and tax exemptions, and then also gave them the exclusive right to dump low-priced tea on the colonial market. Now, low-priced tea is great, except that under the Tea Act, you could only buy it from agents of this company. So local merchants in Philadelphia and New York and wherever, they don't get to sell this tea. So it's undercutting their profits. And it's also annoying the smugglers. And if we've learned anything up to this point, it's that colonial smugglers have a lot of power. So merchants are losing money, smugglers are losing money, Parliament is annoying people again, and the money raised through this scheme, they were also going to take part of it to pay for the colonial governors. So if the assemblies don't like that, there have been taxes on tea before. But when the Tea Act is passed, the colonists want a fight. They said that if they paid this new tax, it would be like saying that Parliament has a right to tax them. And at this point, in the aftermath now of 10 years of squabbling, the colonists aren't willing to say that anymore. As the cheap tea shipments arrive, resistance starts to build in the major ports. And in December of 73, a group of colonists in Boston, Sons of Liberty, disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians and boarded a ship full of tea in Boston Harbor and tossed more than 300 chests of tea into the water. And one of the ringleaders was Samuel Adams, who was a cousin of John Adams, who had defended those soldiers after the Boston Massacre. John Adams was not in favor of this extra-legal mob activity. Sam Adams is totally cool with it. The East India Company lost about, in today's money, about $4 million worth of tea. And the British government has had enough. They have backed down, and they have backed down. They have backed as far as they are willing to go. And now the colonists are destroying private property, and Parliament cannot allow that. So Parliament passed a series of laws that the colonists called intolerable acts, specifically to punish Boston. One of the intolerable acts closed the entire port of Boston until the tea was paid for. But Boston gets all of its money through the port, so with the port closed, how are they going to pay it off? Another intolerable act limited the town meetings that the entire colony of Massachusetts could hold. That was the basis of Massachusetts democracy. And also, a lot of smaller towns out in like western Massachusetts don't understand why they're being punished at all when this was specifically Boston's action. Then another intolerable act said that some positions that used to be elected can now only be appointed by the royal governor. So then people lose that piece of democracy as well. Another intolerable act allowed military commanders to lodge their soldiers in private homes, particularly in the homes of men who were suspected of being members of the Sons of Liberty and part of this Boston Tea Party. Now, at first, other colonies were not interested in Boston's problems. Boston has consistently caused issues with the British government, so if they get smacked down, who cares? But when acts were passed that affected cities outside of Boston, then other colonies started going, oh, yeah, maybe that's not fair. You know, those other little towns, they weren't a part of this, but you're taking away their self-government, right? And if they're going to punish all of Massachusetts just for a handful of crazy dudes in Boston, maybe they're going to start punishing all of us. And at almost the same time that Britain passed these intolerable acts, they also passed the Quebec Act. This really, I can't even think of a word that I can say out loud for what this did to the British colonists. The Quebec Act took the province of Quebec, French Canada, right, which Britain had just gotten control of through the 7 Years' War. The Quebec Act extended the southern boundary of Canada down to the Ohio River. Now, British colonists had been trying to get that land for a long time, right? That's why they started the 7 Years' War, thinking that they would be able to get this land. But when the Proclamation of '63 was passed, right, it blocked them from being able to get that land. And now the British government passes this law that says their own citizens, their own British colonists, cannot cross the mountains to take that land. But the French colonists can. So it looks like Parliament is giving land to French Canadians at the expense of their own original citizens. The Quebec Act also promised full toleration for the Catholic Church in Canada, including allowing French Canadians the ability to vote and hold office. Catholics in Boston couldn't vote and hold office. But if you're a French Catholic in Quebec, you can. If you were Catholic in London, you couldn't hold office. But if you're in Quebec, you can. Why is Parliament giving that right to French Canadian Catholics and not to their own people? And of course, the vast majority of colonists were Protestants, and they weren't really happy with the concept of Catholic toleration at all. But still, why is Parliament allowing these brand new French-speaking citizens a right that they don't extend to their own original citizens? A fear of Catholicism and political tyranny kind of mingled in the minds of a lot of British colonists, especially in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and New Hampshire. The cause of liberty was seen also as the cause of Protestantism. Farmington, Connecticut passed a series of resolutions promising to resist any attack on their freedom, and also saying that by granting political rights to Catholics, Parliament was working with the devil. Now, at this point, the British government no longer seems like a really legitimate government to a whole lot of colonists. Opposition to the Intolerable Acts spread into small towns and into rural areas that had not really gotten involved in the earlier forms of resistance. In September of '74, a convention of delegates from different Massachusetts towns met in Suffolk, Massachusetts, and approved the Suffolk Resolves, which said that colonists should refuse to obey these new laws. They should refuse to pay these new taxes, and they should prepare for war. To coordinate all of this, the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia the same month, September of '74. Colonies sent their most prominent leaders. Well, every colony except Georgia. Georgia didn't send anybody. But Massachusetts sent John and Sam Adams. Virginia sent Patrick Henry and George Washington. Patrick Henry was a really popular speaker. He had this kind of unique style of speaking that was very blunt and very direct, but was also sort of like fiery revivalist preaching. Patrick Henry was the first one to declare that the old distinctions between Virginians and New Yorkers, etc., those distinctions are gone. And he said that he no longer considered himself a Virginian. He considered himself an American. In March of '75, Patrick Henry went back to Virginia and gave a speech urging them to begin preparing for revolution, and concluded by saying, "Give me liberty or give me death." Now, the First Continental Congress took those Suffolk resolves, don't obey the laws, don't pay the taxes, prepare for war. They adopted them themselves. And then the Continental Congress created the Continental Association, which handled the way that would be carried out. The Continental Association called for an almost complete halt to trade with Britain and its other colonies. The only exception that they would allow was rice, because South Carolina had no other way to get money. The Continental Association also encouraged domestic, colonial-based manufacturing, and encouraged people to not be really extravagant in this time that appears to be leading toward war. And Congress authorized local committees of safety, they called it, to oversee all of its rules and to take action against the enemies of liberty, which would include merchants who don't want to boycott. These committees of safety began to bleed real power away from the established, usually loyal to Britain governments, to really these sort of extra-legal grassroots groups who reflect the will of the common people. By early '75, about 7,000 men were serving on local committees of safety all across the colonies. The committees became these training grounds where small farmers and craftsmen and laborers and men who normally wouldn't have a voice in politics are suddenly able to discuss political issues and exercise political power. Like in Philadelphia, when they had the boycotts in the 1760s, those early boycotts had almost entirely been run by prominent, wealthy men. But in the 1770s, those boycotts run by the committees of safety, that's being dominated by new men, by young men, by shopkeepers, by not landowners. And they are determined that they're not going to drop the boycott the way that the elites had before. When the New York Colonial Assembly refused to support the Continental Association, local committees of safety enforced its rules anyway. So power is seeping away from the old elites, and they are really struggling to understand what's happening to their world. As the crisis deepened, the colonists, many of whom are starting to call themselves Americans now, increasingly based their demands not just on the historical rights of Englishmen, but now on the more abstract idea of natural rights and universal freedom. The First Continental Congress defended their actions by appealing to the principles of the English Constitution and to the immutable laws of nature, they said. John Locke's theories of natural rights, of rights that are independent of a government and can't be taken, was a powerful justification for this resistance. Thomas Jefferson declared that Americans were a free people, claiming their rights as derived from the laws of nature. Now, Jefferson still said that Americans loved their king, but he demanded that Britain treat its colonies as equals, held together by loyalty, not as a system where one part rules over everything else. Now, by the time the Second Continental Congress met, in May of 75, war had already broken out between British regular troops and armed Massachusetts militias. On April 19th, 75, a force of British soldiers marched from Boston toward the nearby town of Concord, Massachusetts. They had heard that the local militia was stashing weapons there. They're stockpiling some weapons. So they're gonna take those weapons, confiscate them. And they'd also heard a rumor that John Hancock and Sam Adams were drinking in a tavern along the road to Concord. So, might as well cut the head off the Sons of Liberty while you're on the way to confiscate these weapons. Of course, Hancock and Adams and all of the citizens along these roads were informed before the regular troops got there. You've heard about Paul Revere's ride. Paul Revere, though, was only one of about 19 riders who were sent out in different directions to warn everyone that the regulars were coming, that the professional troops were coming. And Paul Revere and the rest of the riders got their information about how the regular troops were going to move and what direction they were going in by the wife of the British commander. She was American-born. She is very sympathetic toward the colonists' desires, and so she narcs on her husband. And then he sent her to England for the remainder of the war so she couldn't do it again. Skirmishes took place between colonial militias and the regular troops at Lexington, and then again at Concord. And by the time the Brits retreated back to the safety of Boston, 49 colonists and 73 troops were dead. This shot heard round the world began America's War of Independence, and the news of it spread very quickly. When the news reached New York, a poor farmer named Lynn Roberts said that he felt the call of liberty, so he set off to Massachusetts to enlist. In May of 75, Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys joined together with the Connecticut militia. They surrounded Fort Ticonderoga up in New York, and they forced the regulars there to surrender. And then the next winter, Henry Knox, Washington's artillery commander, arranged for the cannon from Ticonderoga to be dragged hundreds of miles east to reinforce the siege of Boston, where the British troops are dug in and Washington is trying to unseat them. Meanwhile, the Second Continental Congress raised an army, printed money to pay for it, appointed George Washington as its commander, but they still won't declare independence. Very few folks were talking about independence at this point, and most of them came from New England. They realized that they needed to attach a Southern face to this cause. Otherwise, it'll just look like Boston causing problems again. That's a large part of why Washington, who is from Virginia, why he was put in charge of the army. Now, even though the colonists weren't ready to be independent, Britain had no reluctance in declaring them all rebels. They sent thousands of troops. They ordered all colonial ports closed. By the end of 75, the breach with Britain seemed beyond repair. But many colonists are still shying away from the idea of independence. They are still proud to be British. And many colonial leaders, especially in colonies that had already dealt with some turmoil, they're afraid that breaking apart with Britain will unleash anarchy. Like those merchants had been afraid. Once you say it's okay to rebel against this authority, where do you stop the rebellion? Those who opposed independence warned that the rebels are going to create a situation where everyone loses their property and we descend into anarchy and chaos and barbarism and blah, blah, blah. So that affected the way that each colony's delegation to the Continental Congress, it affected the way that they responded to the idea of independence. The elites in Massachusetts are pretty confident in their ability to keep control, so they tended to support independence. Massachusetts had borne the brunt of the Intolerable Acts, or as John Adams said, borne the brunt of the king's tyranny, and they are gung-ho to leave. Virginia was on the fence for a while, but then the commander of British troops in Virginia offered freedom to any slave who would fight on the British side. And when that happened, all of a sudden Virginia's like, nope, we're going to be independent too. In a lot of states, like a lot of colonies still, like New York and Pennsylvania, the diversity of the population made it hard to work out a consensus on how far they're willing to go. And in many colonies, the earlier problems that we'd had with Britain had caused small farmers and laborers to start demanding more rights and opportunities for themselves. And so the elites of those colonies are, no matter how much they might scream for their own liberty, they're not always willing to extend it to the people below them. So as 76 dawns, the colonies are in this unusual position of being at war with the British Empire, but still begging for rights within it. Even while the fighting continued, the Second Continental Congress sent a petition to King George. They called it the Olive Branch Petition. They're extending the olive branch. It promised their loyalty, asked for a peaceful reconciliation. It was actually a very recent immigrant from Britain, not a member of one of the old families, who came up with the most effective argument in favor of American independence. Thomas Paine was an English craftsman, and then he was sent over here to be a government official. But he'd only come over in late 74, so he hadn't been here very long. And he quickly fell in with a bad crowd. He got involved with some troublemakers, like John Adams and Ben Rush. And they suggested to Paine that he write up a little pamphlet explaining why he supported American independence. And this was called Common Sense. Common Sense was published in January of 76. And it started not with a list of grievances, which is what most of the other documents started with. It started with an all-out attack on the idea of hereditary power and on the monarchy itself. Up until the 1760s, most colonists believed that the British system, with its king, was the most perfect government in the world. And even up to this point, most of them still said that they liked the king. But Paine said that the English government was corrupt and unrighteous. He said that King George III was a brute and a tyrant, which is not actually a fair thing to say. But Paine said that one honest man was worth more to God than any number of kings. And he said that the best form of government would be a democracy with frequent elections and with the people's rights protected by a written constitution. Paine said that it was absurd that a huge continent, North America, should be governed by a pretty small little island. He said that the colonists' prospects were being limited by staying in the empire, and that if they were liberated, then the colonies could forget the mercantilist laws, they could forget the taxes, they could forget the controls, they could trade how they liked. And he said that independence would also keep the colonies from getting dragged into Europe's imperial wars. He pointed out that Spain and France were never the enemies of Americans. They were the enemies of Britain. And because America was a colony of Britain, America kept getting dragged into it. But he said that if the colonies were liberated, if they became independent, then there would no longer be any reason for us to get dragged into these wars. He just outright said that staying in the empire was a burden on the colonists. What really made common sense unique, though, is not just this extremely vociferous protest against monarchy. It's his way of expressing that idea, and it's the audience that he's writing for. Most political writing was done by the elite for the elite. Most newspapers and pamphlets were meant to be read by men with at least some university education, with classical training, who had probably had private tutors, who could understand Latin and references to French philosophers. Common sense was not written that way. Paine pioneered a new style of political writing, one that was designed to reach the masses. Paine took political philosophy out of the hands of the elite and gave it to the everyman. And we still see the effect of that today. Newspapers today are not written in Latin. It's not written with references to ancient philosophers. Newspapers today, the majority of newspapers published in the United States, are written at a 4th grade reading level. Even the New York Times is only written at a 7th grade reading level. And that is the direct result of common sense. Information needs to be accessible to the people. And that means it needs to be written in a way that the majority of people will understand. And Thomas Paine is the first person to do that. And Common Sense became extraordinarily successful. It sold about 150,000 copies in that first year. And Paine used his share of the profits to buy supplies for the Continental Army. Now, the colonists had been primed for Paine's arguments by the last 10-ish years of conflict with Britain, and then with the outbreak of violence at Lexington and Concord. And so this just kind of adds weight to the movement for independence. In the spring of '76, scores of American towns adopted resolutions in favor of independence. And 6 months after Common Sense was first published, the Second Continental Congress decided that Paine was right. So on July 2nd, 1776, the Second Continental Congress adopted a resolution declaring that the United States is, and by rights ought to be, free and independent of Britain. 2 years later, they approved the document. 2 days later, on July 4th, they approved the document that we called the Declaration of Independence. It was supposed to be written by a committee of 5 men, including John Adams and Ben Franklin and a couple of other guys. It ended up mostly being written by Thomas Jefferson, because everybody else went down to the tavern to drink and kind of left him alone to do it. Most of the Declaration is a long list of complaints. Everything that George III did wrong, everything that Parliament did wrong, everything that went wrong that Jefferson wanted to blame on the king and Parliament, including quartering troops in private homes and taxing without consent. And in the original draft, Jefferson had a clause that condemned the slave trade and the king's support of it. But delegates from Georgia and South Carolina made him take that out before they would approve the Declaration. The real impact of the Declaration of Independence doesn't come from the list of complaints. It comes really from Jefferson's preamble, especially the second paragraph, which says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." By unalienable rights, Jefferson meant rights so basic, so rooted in human nature itself, that no government could take them away. And he's obviously cribbing heavily from John Locke here, right? Jefferson then went on to justify this breach with the British Empire. He wrote, as Locke had, that government gets its power from the consent of the governed. And when a government threatens its subjects' natural rights, then the people have the authority to alter the form of government or to abolish it entirely. The Declaration of Independence is ultimately a declaration of a person's right to rebel. It's not there to put forward a theory of government, really. It's there to justify revolution. And for 200 years, that's exactly what it's been. It's been an inspiration to generations of Americans who have been denied their natural rights, and also to colonial people all over the world who are seeking independence and self-government. The Declaration changed the meaning of American freedom, and also kind of what it meant to be American. Colonists stopped talking about the rights of Englishmen. The rights of Englishmen that come from the crown no longer apply. The object of American independence was to secure the rights of mankind. In Jefferson's language, it was the rights of nature, not their British heritage, that justified independence. In the stroke of a pen, the new United States said that freedom should not be a privilege enjoyed only by an elite few, but that it's a universal entitlement. Now, obviously, they're not going to achieve that right away. The fight for that has continued and will continue. But it's saying that this is what it should be. And Jefferson's argument, natural rights and the right to rebel, obviously are drawing on the writings of John Locke. Locke said government was a social contract, and a government that did not have consent was illegitimate. But Jefferson isn't identical to Locke. Locke wrote about life, liberty, and property. Jefferson substituted pursuit of happiness. And when he did that, he tied the United States to this open-ended democratic process where people should be able to develop their own potential and reach their goals. That walk towards self-fulfillment will become a central element of American freedom, although it'll take a very long time for that goal to come anywhere near being reached. And a distinctive definition of American nationality was born in the Revolution. From this moment, there was this idea of American exceptionalism, the belief that the United States has a special mission to be a refuge from tyranny, to be a symbol of freedom, to be a model for the rest of the world. That has held a central place in American identity and American nationalism. The new nation declared itself to be this workshop of liberty. When Tom Paine wrote Common Sense, he described the colonies as an asylum for mankind. And from the beginning, many revolutionaries intended the U.S. to be that example, intended for the revolution to be of worldwide importance. And again, we have not always lived up to that. But the intention was there. And that idea that the U.S. could be a symbol, that's why Jefferson didn't address the Declaration to Parliament or to George III. He addressed it to the opinions of mankind. The first to sign on was the president of the Second Continental Congress, John Hancock, that Boston merchant who had felt so hard done by when the British impounded his ship before the Boston Massacre. And according to legend, Hancock signed his name so large so that George III could read it without his glasses. So, America has declared independence. Now we gotta win it. And I think we're gonna stop the first part here.